Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 33. In this week's episode, I want to talk about the burdens of being a cycle breaker. These responsibilities and emotions sometimes weigh very heavily on my shoulders, and I know that I'm not alone in this experience. And so I felt like it was important to shed light on this aspect of healing. And so I want to start off by talking about the journey of getting there, sort of everything that leads up to you eventually finding yourself in this position of shouldering the weight of what can feel like generations worth of abuse and trauma, and taking the steps to actively heal those things within yourself and your own personal relationships. And I think this journey can take two drastically different paths. It can be more of a gradual realization or sort of a defining moment that shifts your perspective. And it can be difficult to categorize such an individual and profound experience down to just two ideas. But in what I've read and the people that I've spoken with, it seems like their journey tends to lean more one way or the other. And the first one that I want to address is this more gradual realization. And I think this tends to apply more often than not to a scapegoated child. So if throughout your childhood you found yourself being blamed for everything and you fulfilled the role of scapegoat, chances are you saw the unhealthy behavior for what it was, and you felt compelled to speak honestly about the problems that you and your family were facing, rather than consistently sweeping them under the rug, denying their existence to save face or maintain some unrealistic image of what family is supposed to mean. I think it's common in a scenario like this to understand the situation that you're in and maybe exist in that environment until you're old enough or financially able to go out on your own and distance yourself from the toxicity so that you can start to take the steps to creating a life that you want for yourself. On the flip side of that, you might have been completely naive to the unhealthy behavior that you were enduring throughout your childhood for most of your life, until everything reached a boiling point and you experienced this really traumatic, defining moment that shifted your perspective and allowed you to see things for what they were. And the latter was more so my experience. I think throughout my childhood, I was very controlled, very sheltered, and a way of coping that I don't think I even realized in the moment was through rationalizing even the unhealthiest behaviors. I think I was always searching for a silver lining, telling myself and being told that this is just normal. This is the way that most families are. And sometimes even resorting back to, well, at least now I know what not to do. And I think there's an element of perspective that comes into play that makes these rationalizations so seamless. I think it's really common for children of emotionally immature parents to lack perspective of other healthier relationships, whether it's relationships with friends or parent-child dynamics. I think it stems from control. I remember feeling like my parent never fostered a relationship between myself and peers of mine. And I think it's really common for emotionally unskilled families to fall under this category of a closed family system where you're conditioned to believe that you should never speak about what's going on within the family, outside of the family. And so I think it's normal to rationalize and overlook a lot of unhealthy behaviors throughout our childhood. I remember feeling like this is what's in front of me and I should make the best of it, because who am I to complain? I think that's also a narrative that's reinforced by emotionally immature parents, that there are other people who have it much worse than you do. And so you develop this guilt for ever feeling bad about anything. And I think fostering that sense of guilt for experiencing emotions is one of the key manipulative tactics that an emotionally immature parent will employ to keep you obedient. And it wasn't until I was much older, when I was 21, when the stress and the tension and the manipulation all came to a head. And I experienced this really defining, traumatic moment between my parents and myself, where a line that I never thought would be crossed was crossed. And I think the reason that that moment was so profound for me was because not only did it open my eyes and shift my perspective, sort of prompt me to question everything that I thought I knew, but more than that, it allowed me to feel justified in finally doing something about it. I think up until that point, I was able to rationalize X, Y, and Z. I felt guilty for feeling bad. I was very complacent. I was very obedient. And that particular experience made me realize that maybe I didn't have as firm of a grip on what I was dealing with as I thought I had. And so that allowed me to reevaluate so much of my life and my relationship with my parents, which ultimately led me to the same place that so many of us end up in, whether it's through this key defining moment or a more gradual realization where you felt like it was a long time coming. I think either way, you find yourself in this position where now you're faced with a very difficult decision that, whether you know it or not in the moment, can drastically impact your family dynamic. And I think it's really common, again, whether consciously or subconsciously, to feel the weight of that decision on your shoulders alone. I remember feeling in that moment like, if I don't leave now, I will never leave. And if I stay, then I'm doing myself a disservice. And it was so challenging in some ways to make that decision because I didn't feel like I was allowed to fully. And I think emotionally immature and narcissistic parents alike don't want you to feel powerful. I think one of the ways that they're able to maintain control over you is by ensuring that you feel powerless, like you can't change anything, like you have to exist within this chaos and find a way to be steady yourself and to maybe even steady other people, even though you're not getting any of that guidance or reassurance yourself. I think the more powerful you feel, the more capable of change you feel, the harder you are to control. And ultimately, I decided to leave and to not go back, to finally separate myself from the unhealthy behavior that I was just starting to realize had become my normal, which is a really scary position to find yourself in for a number of reasons. I think there's the obvious tension on the surface that surrounds an event like this. And, I remember feeling throughout my teens and early 20s like very normal experiences, like bringing a boy home that I was dating for the first time, or moving out into an apartment or to live with a friend of mine. These very normal things that you experience as you get older. I remember dreading them because I knew how difficult the conversations around them would be with my parents. And I remember having those feelings under the pretense that my parents and I were on good terms. And so now I find myself in this position. My parents and I are not on good terms. They disagree with what I'm doing. They don't think that I'm making the right decision. And yet I'm faced with this decision anyway. And so something that was already scary is kind of multiplied because there's this elevated level of tension that's now surrounding this experience and making it that much more difficult. And I think growing up in that kind of environment, gaslighting is very common. You are made to doubt your recall, your perception of reality, your own emotions and opinions are called into question more times than one. And something that has been challenging for me at times, even after removing myself from that environment, is not gaslighting myself. I remember thinking at times, well, was it really that bad? Did it really happen like that? Was I just maybe born bad? And did I make my parents act in that way? And so when you're faced with such a heavy decision, I think that personal internal gaslighting can really come into play, because everything inside of you, your instincts, are kind of fighting the more rational side of your brain that's telling you, I shouldn't accept this behavior. This doesn't feel good. This is unacceptable, and I need to remove myself. I think that's the logic. But I think a lot of what you might be feeling on the inside, the more emotional side of your brain, might be working against you. I think you might be questioning your own decision. You might be doubting the experience and how it happened, trying to imagine it from another perspective where maybe your parents weren't the aggressors. Maybe they weren't at fault. It's like you want to fight against all of these things, maybe because you don't want to believe it to be true. But at the end of the day, when logic and reason win out and you ultimately make the decision to distance yourself in one way or another from your parents, there are a lot of emotions that are going to come flooding out. And it might not be right away. It might be more of a gradual realization and release, which it was in my case. I still sometimes find myself recalling certain events and looking at them through a new lens, or experiencing something in my current life that triggers an old emotion or brings a memory to the surface that I hadn't fully processed yet, that gives me some insight into who I am now and the way that I react to certain things. It's sort of a constant evolution, I think, and it starts by taking that first step, by taking your life into your own hands for the first time, despite what you might be feeling on the inside. And after being out of that environment, if you have some perspective and you're able to look back on it, I think that's exactly how your parents would want you to feel. They would want you to feel scared and guilty and doubtful, and to question whether or not you're doing the right thing, to consider going back, because that is the way that they will be able to regain and maintain control over you. And so now you're kind of stepping out into the unknown, which can be scary enough as it is when you have the support of your immediate family and even friends of yours. But now, having made this decision, I felt like I put myself in the crosshairs. Like I was now going to be the target of a lot of negativity. And I would be lying if I said that that wasn't daunting. I think anytime you experience a real significant change in your life, it's so crucial to have a support system to fall back on, whether that's family or friends. I think having people who love you and care about you, who have your best interest in mind, who you can sort of let your guard down with, having those spaces makes navigating challenging times that much easier, because you're reminded of who you are, of why you got started, of what your goals are. And despite whatever you might be facing on the surface, you have this sense of calm, this sense of comfort and support, that you know that no matter how this thing goes, whether it's a new job or a big move, or you're dating someone new and you're not sure how it's going, despite how these things might play out, you have this sense of home that is unchanging. And I think having that solid foundation allows you to confidently move into more uncertain aspects of your life. But I think for so many of us who find ourselves in the position of breaking the cycle and removing ourselves from these toxic family environments, what happens when we make the decision to do that sometimes is that we lose that support system. And so now we're navigating probably the most substantial challenge that we have ever faced in our lives without the support of our family. And that can take a significant toll on your sense of self, your identity, your confidence, and the way that you operate and navigate relationships. I think existing and trying to move forward in something that is completely new to you without that reassurance can feel entirely overwhelming. It can feel hopeless and confusing and isolating. And that is another way that narcissistic parents and emotionally immature parents alike might try to break you down as you make this decision by completely dismantling your support system outside of them. And I think one of the main ways that they do this is through a smear campaign. So with the weight that you're already shouldering of understanding that you single-handedly, even though your actions were a direct result of someone else's behavior, your action has the potential to disrupt your family dynamic, to completely change the way that things have always been. And you'll be able to kind of pinpoint this time in your family's history to this decision, this action of yours that was a catalyst for that change. I think you're already dealing with the weight of that. And on top of that, there's this fear now that in an attempt to completely discredit you, your parent might spread lies about you. They might go to your friends or to extended family members feigning concern for you, saying that, oh, you're hanging out with the wrong people, or maybe you got into some of the wrong things and you've really kind of lost it. You're not thinking clearly. You're making all of these bad decisions and you're treating us so horribly. I can't believe what's happening. And I think all of this is done in an attempt to preserve that unrealistic image of what emotionally immature parents think family is or should be. But it's an added layer of stress and isolation for those of us who find ourselves in this position, who take on this role of breaking the cycle. We have to know going into it, we have to come to terms with the idea that by doing this, making a decision that is right for us, we might lose most of the people in our lives that we once considered to be very important to us. And that makes that decision that much harder. And yet, so many of us find a way to push through, because the truth of the matter is, no one deserves to be abused. No one deserves to live their life in fear of being controlled or manipulated or lied to. And if you find yourself in that position, and you're bold and courageous and brave enough to get yourself out of that situation, you should feel proud. You should feel like you had the strength that so many people before you lacked. And yet there are so many negative emotions and words and actions that are being thrown your way as you're experiencing that it can be really challenging to tap into the more positive side of this decision that you're making. In my experience, I endured both a smear campaign that was less public and more personal, and also love bombing. And I think this is another one of those aspects where there's a real duality to how this decision can play out. And again, it's unique to every person's experience, but these, I think, are two very common experiences that you might encounter. And so I, to this day, am uncertain about what my parents have said to friends or extended family members of mine about me or my decision or the current state of affairs. But in the time shortly after moving out of my parents' house, I was bombarded with text messages for days or weeks at a time even. And I think one of the first courses of action for them was this very personal, targeted smear campaign where they wanted to make me feel like I was a terrible person for doing what I did. And this consisted of paragraphs of just the most hurtful personal messages that you can imagine. Pictures of me from when I was younger, even just a couple of years prior, saying things like, "Where did she go? You're not this person anymore. I miss her. Where is she? You were so this, that, and the other thing, and now you're doing this." I don't think people who haven't personally experienced this can fully understand the gravity of that kind of a personal attack from your parents, because especially if you lived most of your life in that second scenario where you were kind of naive to a lot of the behavior that you were enduring, that was sort of my experience. I always felt like I did my best to show up for my family. Like, I genuinely loved and cared about my parents and always wanted to make them happy. I felt like there was nothing, everything else was secondary to pleasing my parents and making them proud. And I always thought that it was coming from a good place. Again, until I experienced sort of this defining moment where I started to realize maybe it was much more transactional than I ever could have imagined. And so I had this vision of myself as a very good-natured, pure-hearted person who wanted the best for her family and who cared a lot about the people in her life. And to see that image of myself be completely dismantled by my parents, whose approval I sought more than anything in life, I think, was devastating. To feel like now, because I'm making a decision that's right for me, because I'm actually putting myself first and saying, hey, it's not okay for you to treat me this way. I'm doing the right thing. For that to be the catalyst for all of these positive feelings that I had about myself to be systematically just kind of destroyed was so upsetting. It really got to me. I think I understood to one extent or another that they were angry and that they wanted me back. And there was part of me that still felt like this is coming from a genuine place. Maybe they really just miss me. I didn't realize then that they just missed the control that they had over me. But despite all of that, it still made me so sad to feel like whatever was going on in my parents' minds was enough for them to personally attack me in such an aggressive and hurtful way. It's another one of those instances that I can reflect on now and see very clearly where their priorities were. And the fact that control was more important than my own well-being in their life and in their idea of a family dynamic, which now offers me a bit of comfort in my decision. But at the time, not knowing nearly as much as I know now about my personal family history and also about emotional intelligence as a whole, it was much harder for me to deal with. It was a much more significant challenge. And so I experienced this more personal smear campaign where I was being told how bad of a person I was directly to my face, or at least over text message. And on the flip side of that, I also experienced some love bombing. I think there was an aspect of the love bombing where my parents wanted to appear as victims, like they couldn't live without me, that they were devastated, that they so badly wanted me to move back home, that they weren't sleeping through the night, that they were crying all the time, that nothing was normal anymore. And putting the entirety of that weight on my shoulders and my shoulders alone in an attempt to guilt me into going back into that environment. And looking back on it, even now, it's so clear where the problem lies, that they weren't able in any way to assess the situation, that clearly something had happened, there was a big shift, and to acknowledge their own part in it, to take responsibility for the role that they played. Instead, they were consistently portraying themselves as innocent victims so that I would feel like it was my responsibility, again, to fix things, to put my own feelings, wants, and needs aside to better serve them, to offer them the comfort and reassurance that they needed. It was a repetition of the same cycle that I had been experiencing unconsciously for so long. But the difference this time was that I was becoming a little bit more aware of it. I was gaining a little bit of outside perspective, and I had the time and space finally to freely think and to allow myself to entertain these different ideas and to hear my voice. My voice was no longer drowned out by the opinions of other people. I didn't feel pressured to share in someone else's thought process or to blindly follow because I was in an environment where I wasn't going to get punished for feeling differently for the first time in my life. And that was really life-changing. And I think despite how difficult that time was for me, I'm really proud that I was able to maintain that boundary and to keep myself out of that environment and to not go back. But I think it's so important to acknowledge how devastating experiencing something like that from your parents can be, and how easy it can make that decision to go back feel. You start to feel like if I just do this, then everything can go back to normal. But instead, you're prioritizing yourself. You're making the right decision by, I cannot stress this enough, you are making the right decision by removing yourself from an abusive environment and relationship. There are no two ways about it. And so you voluntarily put yourself in this very uncomfortable position where you feel like the bad guy and you're being made to feel like the bad guy. And now you're also feeling the weight of being the person who changed your family dynamic. And again, when I say that, I want you to recognize that you making the decision to remove yourself from that environment did not negatively impact your family. Your decision was preceded by years of manipulation and control that went undetected. And that is the true reason that things in your family dynamic are now different. And I think in a lot of situations, if emotionally immature parents were able to take a step back, to take some accountability, to approach things in a healthy way, such a drastic decision would not need to take place. And yet so many of us find ourselves there. And on the surface, we can feel like we are the person who changed things, who caused that change, because we were brave and bold enough to actually put our foot down and say, enough's enough. But this brings to the surface this whole new challenge that can come along with being a cycle breaker. Let's say you've moved out, you've distanced yourself in one way or another. I think it's very common for those decisions to lead to a low or no contact relationship. And that begs the question of, what do we do when we're faced with a big family event? Maybe it's a wedding or a graduation or a baby shower, something that involves your extended family, people that you care about, that you want to show up for. You still want to foster those relationships and be a part of your family. But now you're existing in the same space with people who have hurt you, who have maybe not taken accountability for that hurt, and maybe you're not speaking very much. There could be a very palpable, obvious tension between the two of you. And this is also something that I've personally experienced, where I didn't want to miss out on these very important life events. And so I would show up despite the discomfort that comes along with being in close proximity to my parents, especially after having gone no contact. And I think it's so easy to feel like other people are aware to a certain extent that something is off. Because when you have two people, in my case, who maybe used to be very talkative, very involved, there was a clear relationship there, to now we're on opposite sides of the room, not making eye contact with one another. There's clearly been a shift. And it comes back to that same idea where you feel the weight of changing your family dynamic. And so you can be in these spaces where you're there to celebrate another person and yet feel like you sort of have a bit of a spotlight on you because you're the one, not really, but you can feel like this, who's causing the awkwardness or the tension or the stress. And it's such an unfair position, I think, to find yourself in. Because again, you're just doing the thing that people before you would not do or could not do. And I think that kind of courage should be applauded and admired And yet, in a situation like that, you may not want to take the time to trauma dump on your extended family and to tell them what's actually going on. It might not be the time or place. You might not have that kind of relationship with them where you feel comfortable getting into all of these different emotions and vulnerabilities and family history. And so you just kind of have to deal with what's happening on the surface. And so it can be really challenging to not feel like a spectacle in those instances, because there can be a very clear distinction between the last time that your extended family or friends witnessed your family unit as a whole versus what they're seeing now. And I think it raises a lot of questions that it's not your responsibility to answer, that people may not even feel comfortable asking. And so there can sort of just be this air of discomfort that you're very aware of in what should be an otherwise very exciting, happy experience. I think a bit of a side note to that also, depending on where you are in your healing journey and your relationship with your parents after you've made the decision to distance yourself, how they've taken it, you might feel compelled to slip back into that role of appeasement, of people pleaser, kind of fulfill your childhood role again. And to maintain that image, I think if you don't feel like you want to trauma dump on people, if you don't want to answer those questions, the easier route, sometimes it might appear to be easier, is to fall back into that role, to maintain that image and to pretend like everything is fine. And I think this is one of those instances where you have to do what makes you feel the most comfortable. Because I've been in situations where I've done both. I think when you are presented with that relationship and you are in a close space with the people whose behavior is the root of some of the most challenging issues that you have ever faced in your life, that you are most likely still facing, you can feel caught off guard. You may not know how to act. And there have been times where I seamlessly slipped back into that role. And it wasn't until after I was out of that experience that I thought to myself, why did I do that? Why did I even pretend like everything was fine? It's clearly not. I didn't know what else to do. And then there were other times where I more consciously made a decision to exchange pleasantries, let the experience come and go, and move on. And there have also been times when I set and maintained a firm boundary of no contact. And despite the discomfort, and again, feeling maybe like a spectacle, like people who knew my family and our relationship in the past were kind of looking a little curious, wondering what's going on there. Despite it all, I think there were times when I set and maintained that boundary because that is what I felt like I had to do for my own mental peace in that moment. And I think it's really important in these instances for you to be patient with yourself in figuring that out, because chances are you won't understand what feels right or what the right course of action is for you right off the bat. It might take some trial and error and some adjusting, and that is perfectly okay. I think you have to forgive yourself for allowing yourself that space for trial and error, if that makes sense. And so one of the last things that I want to talk about in terms of burdens of being a cycle breaker is the discomfort that you have to sit with when you're finally faced with these emotions and experiences that your predecessors, for lack of a better term, would deny or shove down and never truly face. In my personal experience, being raised by emotionally immature parents, there was little distinction between my thoughts, my emotions, and myself. It felt like all of these things were a part of me. I wasn't just a person experiencing emotions or thinking thoughts. It felt like I was my thoughts and I was my emotions. These things kind of defined who I was. And I think that puts a lot of weight on your thoughts and your emotions, and it can feel impossible to change them or to get out from under them. And it took me a while to realize after moving out that I am not my thoughts. I am not my emotions. I am for, again, lack of a better term, just a vessel that is experiencing these different things. And I have to figure out how to process them in a way that serves me. And that provided me with a lot of freedom because I no longer felt so permanently tied to these very fleeting things. And that, I think, was the first step in teaching myself to acknowledge my emotions. Once you're able to start thinking about them outside of yourself, I think you're able to start seeing them a bit more objectively, understanding that they can come and go. They are impermanent. And so when I would feel something like anxiety or stress or overwhelm, I was able to eventually start to acknowledge these emotions. I think that was the first step, was teaching myself to acknowledge the emotions that I was feeling. And to follow that up, the thoughts that I was having, especially the intrusive thoughts, the unwelcomed thoughts. I didn't feel so weighed down by them anymore because I understood that they were just thoughts. They're not reality. Similarly with emotions. But that can be really challenging to teach yourself to acknowledge emotions when in the past there was no clear distinction between your emotions and yourself. And so after you've done that, and you can start to recognize how you're feeling when you're feeling it, you can take it one step further and start to ask yourself, why am I feeling it? And I think in those instances when you're faced with an uncomfortable emotion, especially having been raised in an emotionally unintelligent household, your reaction can be to just deny these emotions, to deny their existence. They're not there, to shove them down, to not face them, to pretend like everything is fine, because that's what you've been conditioned to do for so much of your life. That is what feels comfortable and normal and safe. You're familiar with that, but that is not helpful. I can't put it any clearer, because every emotion that you shove down will resurface, and it'll resurface much later and in a very obscure way where it makes much less sense why that thing is coming to the surface. You're going to have to do more work to trace it back instead of simply facing it as it comes. And so that, I think, is where the clear distinction comes in between our parents and ourselves. Even our grandparents, maybe, this idea of generational trauma. I think for a lot of emotionally immature parents, that is the knee-jerk reaction, is to deny the uncomfortable emotions so that you don't have to face them within yourself. And the difference with, I think, so many of us who are actively taking steps to break these cycles is that we are allowing ourselves to sit with this discomfort, which I applaud every single person who is doing this, because I understand firsthand how challenging that can be, how overwhelming it can be, and how you can feel sometimes like, I just don't want to do this. I don't want to think about this. I don't want to have to figure this thing out and allow myself to be uncomfortable for this amount of time without knowing whether or not this is going to work. I don't know how long it's going to last. There's so many questions. It can feel very looming, sort of impending. And yet it's the only way that we can heal, and heal in a way that is substantial and sustainable. And that is the beauty, I think, of being a cycle breaker. And with that, I think that was a great way to end this week's episode. I didn't even see that one coming. But if you enjoyed this week's episode, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you're listening on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. I really appreciate it. And I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.